Welcome to this episode of Real Christianity. My name is Dale Partridge, where each week I offer 15 to 20-minute answers to tough theological and pastoral questions. This is a 100% listener-supported audio ministry of relearn.org. And for those who don't know, our mission at relearn.org is to educate and equip ordinary Christians to plant biblical, confessional, and missional house churches. For more information, just visit relearn.org/house. Are you guys curious to learn more about how a biblical house church works? Have you ever wondered what's the difference between, say, a Bible study and a house church or a home group? Have you thought about joining or planting a house church in your area, but you just don't know where to begin? Well, we're going to be discussing all of this and more on today's episode, but before we dive in, I'd like to make just two quick announcements. The first is about supporting our ministry financially. Some of you guys might know relearn.org offers a growing library of articles, videos, podcasts, sermons, and PDFs that are completely free to the public. We just built a brand new and beautiful new website. So go ahead and check out relearn.org if you have not seen it. We also offer paid courses on church planting, marriage, addiction, etc. But that said, none of these are free to create. It all costs money and time. And as of now, we really do need your help to meet the demands of our annual budget and to serve those who need these resources but can't always afford them. If our ministry or this podcast has been impactful to your spiritual growth, would you prayerfully consider supporting relearn.org financially? You can do this by just making a $10 per month reoccurring donation, or a one-time donation, maybe of $100. But these donations really do keep us in ministry. We have probably 200, 300 people that just give $5 a month or $20 a month or $50 a month. And if this interests you and you would like to support the work that we're doing here, you can make a tax-deductible donation by just going to relearn.org/donate. Again, that's relearn.org/donate. The second resource that I want to talk to you about just briefly is something I think will be helpful with today's episode. A lot of people are curious how traditional church doctrine works in a house. Like, what does it really look like? If you want to learn more about that, I wrote, along with our theological advisory board, a copy of a little book. I don't even want to call it a book. It's like a booklet. It's less than 100 pages. It's titled House Church: The Doctrines, Convictions, and Liturgy of a Biblical House Church. It's a living document, meaning that it's constantly growing and changing, especially here in the beginning phases of our ministry. But it's a great resource for many people who have been a part of our ministry so far. You can go and get that at relearn.org/house. Just scroll down and you'll see a copy of it there. All right, so we're going to dive into today's question. It's from Jared, and he's from Chicago, Illinois. And he asks, Dale, I know you're a house church planter and pastor, and the idea of Christians gathering in homes is becoming more intriguing to me these past several months. Tell me, what does an average house church gathering look like? Do these types of gatherings have a certain structure, or is it more organic, like a Bible study? All right, Jared, thank you for writing in. Well, in light of the coronavirus pandemic and the increasing political hostility here in the West that we're seeing, some of you guys may have seen there's more and more church hostility. People are yelling at people going into churches. People are burning down churches. People are rioting in front of churches. So there is an increasing hostility that's going on in the West around church. And more Christians are asking this exact question. In fact, our free PDF, The Basics of Biblical House Church, has been downloaded over 2,000 times in the last 90 days. So more and more people are for sure finding an interest in the idea of house church. And it's my experience that the homeschooling world has really paved the way for our comfort for home churching, meaning that we've done things at home for schooling. That's not that different. So maybe we can do it with church as well. So I think there's a correlation there. If you haven't read my article, Jared, or anybody that's listening, on the predictions of how the coronavirus might change the local church forever, you can do that. And I think it would be a really good resource for you. It's at stjustins.org/coronavirus. And that's just stjustins.org/coronavirus. I'll put a link in the show notes there for you as well. That's our companion ministry. We've had about 25,000, maybe even 30,000 people read that article since I wrote it in April. And so far, every prediction has been generally accurate, but only time will tell if the long haul predictions reign true. But it's a good read for those that are interested. But to answer your question, Jared, what does an average biblical house church gathering look like? Well, let me begin first, and I'll get to your question, but let me begin first with expelling a few negative claims about house church. When many people, especially pastors, hear the term house church, they usually think of a group of angry, church hurt, anti-traditional church folks who are disorganized, lack doctrine, and sit in a circle with their Bibles and an acoustic guitar. And I know that for two reasons. First, I talk to a lot of pastors, and that's generally their perspective when I tell them that I'm a house church planter. They're very hesitant with the idea of house church. And I have to usually explain my way of why what we're doing is actually biblical and that we're actually quite unified with them. Second is that was actually my experience for some time. 10 years ago, I became really frustrated with the institutional church, particularly the mega church, because I lived in Southern California. I even became part of a house church of church hurt people who were lacking sound doctrine and had a sense of spiritual elitism. And, meaning that we thought that our way of doing church was the right way or a better way or the best way of doing church. And that is the kind of position of a lot of house churches out there. And it's not right. It's not healthy. That season for me was both prideful and wrong. It was not healthy. It was divisive. And God has humbled me over the years to appreciate the mosaic of expressions within the church. We have to remember, guys, that the church is big. And if you haven't read a book on church history, that'll show you how big the church is. There's a book called Church History in Plain Language. It's a really great book. It's 600 pages, but it'll give you a full breadth of the church, a great place to start. But, there's diversity in these interpretations of secondary and tertiary issues. But the Protestant church of the Reformation, what I would call the biblical church, is unified in the gospel. And that's the core of what I want to talk about right now. Unity is critical when you have size. It looks massive, and you might have some different interpretations, again, on these secondary and tertiary issues. But as long as you're unified on the core essentials, that is what's important. I think of a quote from St. Augustine, who says, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. So basically, in the essentials, like the gospel, the Trinity, the doctrine of God, the state of man, the hypostatic union, etc., we must be unified. Those are essential. Those are big blocks of the Christian faith. In non-essentials, think eschatology, Paedo versus Credo baptism, style of church government, the institution of the sacraments, how that's supposed to be done. These things, we can celebrate the liberty and latitude in the church. But then he says, in all things, charity, meaning that, whether you're unified or diversified, we must be loving about that stuff. And I think the lesson of this whole concept is really that we can be unified without being uniform. And we need to remember that as we look at different denominations. Now, personally, I have a conviction that biblical house church, due to its size and intimacy, produces a very fruitful and mature congregation. That has been my experience. Is it better or right? Of course not. That's not my claim that it's better or right. Do some Christians thrive in smaller and more intimate church environments? Absolutely. Are there large biblical churches that are fruitful and mature as well? Absolutely. I think about John MacArthur's church or John Piper's previous church or Tim Keller's church, right? These are healthy churches. So my point is this. Biblical house church is not supposed to compete with the traditional church. It's supposed to complement it. It's not better or different church doctrine. It's simply a different location and smaller expression where that church doctrine is walked out. And size really does change things, right? So, in a house church, it's less of a monologue and more of a dialogue. It's less consumer-centric and more contributor-centric. It's less visitor-centric and more committed-centric. It's less outreach-focused and more discipleship-focused. So there's some things that do change in the walking out of that ecclesiology, that biblical ecclesiology. It's the same ecclesiological convictions, different location. And so we can be unified with the traditional church and be complementing to it, not competing against it. But we need to be clear that we are a biblical house church movement. And I'll explain what that means in just a minute. But again, Jared, you're asking, what does it really look like at the ground level? So to be honest, if you go to a biblically grounded church now, like a traditional church, it probably looks very similar to that, just in a different location. Any biblical house church that's in our relearn.org house church network, which is still very small at this point, is what's called a confessional church. That means that these churches adhere to certain historic statements of faith and standards for church practice, which is really helpful because you can bring identification to what these churches believe, because house churches don't have a website where they can post their statement of faith and church doctrines that they adhere to. So knowing that any church that you would maybe find in the future, which we don't have a church locator at this point, but in the future, you would know that these churches are in alignment with these certain statements of faith, which is very helpful. And what that means really is that we have elders and deacons at these churches, and ecclesiastical convictions, biblical order, worship, prayer, pastoral preaching, giving, the Lord's Supper, and even an order of worship or liturgy. In other words, a biblical house church is not a Bible study or small group. It's a full functioning church that just happens to meet in a home. But it doesn't want to just meet in a home. It actually intends to stay in a home, because part of the DNA of a house church is the intimacy and the size, the closeness that can be accomplished in a small community like that. If the church grows, it multiplies into another biblical fellowship in the local area, which again is slightly different than just getting a bigger building and a bigger building and a bigger building. So for us, a typical house church gathering looks something like this. We get together at 10 a.m. On Sunday, and we rotate houses every few weeks to share the blessing of hosting. We have anywhere between 7 to 10 families is pretty common in a house church, with a few singles. So we fellowship for the first 30 minutes, just kind of hanging out. Hey, how's everybody doing? And we start our meeting at 10:30. We have a printed out order of worship that we follow. Again, kind of like a program that you might have at your church. I call this our free worship liturgy because it offers us a schedule of the day, but our size still offers us the flexibility of it being adjusted on the fly. And by that, I mean, we're not militant to follow the schedule perfectly, and members are actually free to suggest additional songs or share something edifying that might be prompted by the Holy Spirit as we work through the liturgy for the day. But in our order of worship, we begin with prayer, then we sing a few hymns, and we do other more modern songs that are scripturally accurate. We pray for the government and the persecuted church, and again, all these are shared roles. So it's not just the pastor speaking, it's actually an orderly yet interactive and engaging meeting of the saints. So it's kind of distributed responsibility of sharing these roles. of doing these things. Next, we read one chapter aloud from either the Old Testament or the New Testament, and we discuss that a bit. We move into what's called our open meeting. And this is typically, this is based off of 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 26 through 40 or so. And this is typically about 20 to 30 minutes of open discussion for prayer requests, personal revelations, testimonies, praise reports, maybe even a mini teaching from one of the men in the room. And so that's the space right there. It's very fun. It's probably the best part of the meeting because we get a chance to see what's going on in each other's lives and pray for one another. Then one of the elders will preach an expository sermon verse by verse from a little podium that moves with the church. So if we move houses, it just comes with it. And then lastly, one of the deacons or the elders will lead the congregation through a time of personal reflection, a little time of silence of prayer and repentance prior to communion. And we'll do communion together as a church, and then we do announcements, we close with prayer, and then we have 2 to 3 hours of fellowship over a potluck. And this is, again, just a wonderful time of connection and a really beautiful time of fellowship where we get to do life with each other and talk with each other and get close. So again, this is not a Bible study or a home group. Lots of churches I've noticed lately call their small groups house churches. That's quite misleading. That's not what our ministry is doing. Every church that will be in our house church network is led by a theologically trained and qualified, according to 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1, elder/pastor. And if you, if you're interested in this, and this is like, hey, we want to check this out, or and you're just an average Christian, but you're mature, you've read your entire Bible, you maybe served in the church in some other capacity, and you might be interested in planting a biblical house church. We offer a really great 1-year training program at stjustins.org. You can check that out, and we would love to talk to you. So hopefully that answers your question, Jared, and hopefully that gives everybody that's listening a basic understanding of what house church is. I'm going to leave you guys with 2 resources that you can find on the post page for this episode at relearn.org. This is episode 106, titled, What is a Biblical House Church? The first resource is, again, I mentioned it earlier, if you're uncertain with kind of what might happen with the Western Church over the next few years, consider reading my article, How the Coronavirus Might Change the Local Church Forever. I linked the article for you there in the show notes. The second is our free PDF ebook titled The Basics of Biblical House Church. Again, that will be linked in the show notes as well. And if you guys are a regular listener to the Real Christianity podcast, first, we want to thank you. We're right about to pass 2 million downloads. So what an incredible community we have here. But would you guys leave a review? These reviews really do help the exposure of the show. You don't even need to write anything, just tap the stars. But if you just go to the podcast app and you just leave a review, that would be very helpful for us. Also, if you haven't yet, follow us, our ministry, on Instagram by just going to @RelearnHQ on Instagram, and we would love to have you following along with us there. Hopefully this was a helpful episode for you guys. My name is Dale Partridge, and we will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Real Christianity. If you're a regular listener to this show, would you prayerfully consider making a donation to support our ministry efforts? Simply visit relearn.org/donate. Again, that's relearn.org/donate. And for those looking to explore the idea of joining or planting a church in your home, you can download our free PDF ebook titled The Basics of Biblical House Church by visiting relearn.org/house. Lastly, do you have a theological question you would like answered on the show? Submit your question at relearn.org/question. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Real Christianity. We'll see you next Wednesday.